In this video, we're going to take a look at Califolio Vert Moyen. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. I like green inks, and I've never, denied that in any way. And I'm a sucker for a nice green with good shading. So I step right up to the front of the line for this one. Generally consistent in tone, but an extreme an extreme nib change can cause a little bit of a tone change. Just a little bit. It does shade, and very well. Not that full camouflage shading that I love so much, but it shades really well regardless, and pretty consistently. Personally, I use green very frequently, and I can see using this a bunch, perhaps causing me to devour a bottle quite quickly. I'm definitely putting this one on my list for when my bottle of green that I'm currently using runs out. This is going to be on the queue to take a place on my shelf. I see this as a really, really beautiful tone that looks great on just about every paper. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Sailor Riello with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairefontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get a very, very nice green tone here. It's just beautiful to look at. Now, it doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. We would be surprised if it did. It does shade very well. I mean, keep in mind this is a fine. And you see it going light to dark in more, dark to light in than, light to dark in meets. Every single word is constantly shifting in tone, and it's beautiful. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone that we had with the fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading absolutely beautifully, constantly in and out of darker and lighter tones in every word. Even on the second line of goes light to dark at the bottom of the F. Just a two-letter word, and we get some tone shift. When you get to the fifth line, the letter A, one word A, and you see that it starts lighter and gets darker. Awesome. Looking at the double broad, you see that it is only ever so slightly darker than it was with the medium or the fine. Now, it doesn't hit the lighter tones that the medium or fine did. It more works from the mid to dark tones. So, went from a medium to a double broad to see it get darker. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's shading incredibly well and helps my handwriting with a double broad look better than it normally would. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We can easily write back here. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done a Pelikan M120 Idyllic Blue with a fine nib. A Pelikan P200 with a medium nib. A Pelikan M205 the Duo Highlighter with a double broad nib. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, we get roughly the same tone. It's just about the same, maybe only a smidgen lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading. It's shading, I want to say, just as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, which is a feat in itself because this paper is quite a bit more absorbent. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone that we had with the fine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get good shading. I want to say it shades as well as the fine did on this paper, but it does not shade as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. Still doing an amazing job with it, though. Looks oh so nice. Looking at the double broad, it is just a tad bit darker than we had with the medium. Again, we're not getting those lightest tones of the medium, only the mid and darker tones. We get no feather, no spread, shading absolutely, and I tend to struggle with the double broad in the reporter notebooks. I think this ink is making my handwriting look better with it. I'm not taking any credit for spending time writing with that pen. It's the ink. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a Field Notes reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib on this just a bit off-white paper. Now, it's not adjusting the tone. It is a little bit lighter than we had with the Clairefontaine, about the same tone that we had with the WritePad. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It's only shading a little bit. Now, what I'm getting is light to mid-tones. None of the darker tones really happening here. It is doing it a little bit, but nowhere near as much. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone that we had with the fine. We have no feather. We have no spread. We have a little bit of shading, about as much shading that was going on with the fine, which is less than we've had with the other papers so far. Still kind of there. I'm not sure if it's the absorbent nature of this paper or if it is the tone of the paper that's making it go away. Probably the absorbency. Looking at the double broad, it is just that tad bit darker than it was with the medium or the fine. Lighter than we were getting with the Clairefontaine, and I think it still is a decent tone. Now, we are getting quite a bit of feathering. It's tiny feathering all over it. Really just look at the word geometry or butt, and you see the whole thing constantly is a little jagged around the edges of the writing. There's no real spread, and there's only the tiniest hint of shading. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we had no bleeding, only very slight ghosting with the double broad, but you could easily write back here with no problem. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the last paper. Now, we're not getting any feathering. We're not getting any spread. We're getting less shading than we've had on any of the papers so far. We are still getting a nice, crisp, refreshing green. It looks very nice. Again, almost no shading, though. This paper is not going to bring out shading. This is just, I think, a very good, inexpensive paper. Doesn't bring out the best qualities of an ink. Looking at the medium nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the fine. It's not feathering. I'm taking that back because I see it on the T of revolutionary. But I don't really see the feathering really anywhere else. So it does have that moment that occurred. There's no spread. There is shading. It's shading much better here than it did with the fine. It looks good. I think that feathering moment, it could have been just oils on the page from my hand, although I try to wear that glove. Looking at the double broad, we see that it is a bit darker than it was with the medium or the fine. We see that it does feather fairly consistently the whole way through. I really think this does not look good from that pen on this page for that reason. It feathers in a way that's kind of distracting. It draws my eye immediately to it, like the LY of only. My eye goes straight there. The F of after, straight to it as a problem. It doesn't really shade, although you can spot one or two darker areas. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it's only really the fine and maybe the medium that you could write on the back of the page easily. Nothing bled through and touched the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Krishna Gat Green. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Green number 3. Here is Monteverde Emerald Green. Here is Robert Oster Spearmint. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get a little bit darker tone than we've gotten on any of the other papers as its general tone here. It does feather a little bit. Only a couple spots that really look problematic to me, like the S in perhaps, the H in perhaps, but it is feathering quite a bit. There is almost no spread, and almost, well, no, I will say it actually is shading a little bit, even on this paper. Looking at the medium nib, we see that it's about the same tone that we had with the fine, which is a little bit darker than what was going on the Clairefontaine. It does feather a little bit. It does spread a little bit. It does have a few moments of shading that occur, but just as infrequently as what was really going on with the fine, but it is still there, so we'll give it the credit for that. Looking at the double broad, you can see it spread while I'm writing. Okay, the tone's a little darker than we had with the fine or the medium. It does feather fairly consistently all over the place, and you can see the spread happening while I'm writing. Shading, Not really, it's just a green here, but just don't use a double broad on this paper then. Looking at the back of the page, there's a ton of spots that I circled where it did bleed through and touch the page underneath, and we can see why with the amount of extreme ghosting. There's no writing back here. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is an orange ink by Diamine, their 150th anniversary Golden Honey. Here is a green ink by Noodlers, their Grün Cactus Eel, a lubricated ink. Here is a black ink by Lamy, Black. Here is a red ink by Noodlers, their Habanero. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, the tone itself is very much like what we had on the Clairefontaine. It has a tiny bit of feathering that's going on, but I don't see it as largely being distracting and a problem. Now, if you slow down a bit during your writing, like you're going to see on the third line when I hit on his, you see I slowed down for some reason and it got gross. It's not shading at all, but we don't really expect it. Looking at the medium nib, it is about the same tone that we have with the fine. It still feathers. It has a tiny bit of spread compared to, say, the Clairefontaine. I would expect that. It's not, well, I want to say it's not shading, but there are a couple darker spots, which are usually a warning sign of things to come with this paper. Looking at the double broad, it is darker than we had with the fine or the medium, and it is about the same tone that we had on the Clairefontaine. It does feather, it does spread a little bit. Actually, I think considering what we're writing with here, it's not horrible, but I wouldn't want to use it on anything other than this kind of a test. Now, it's not really shading, though you could argue that some areas are a little bit darker than others. Looking at the page underneath, we see that it did bleed through and touch in each of the pens, but only once with the fine. And when we see the back of the page, we see that there's a ton of ghosting, meaning you can't write back here. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? Even though the double broad was just slightly darker, I'm calling this really a super consistent ink. It's boring in that it's predictable, and boring is beautiful. So consistent in tone and shading, it really does make this a dealer's choice. I believe that you can ink any pen you want with it and know what you're going to get, which I generally think of as a good thing. The major factor is going to, as usually would be, the paper that you choose to write on. Just don't use it on the copy paper or on that one horrible reporter notebook. That's all. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.